All right, friends, let's get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad you're here. That was a delightful response. Thank you for that. We, of course, are here for this year's installment of our Stagg lectures, and our speaker this morning is Dr. Meredith Stone. I'm going to introduce Meredith, and then are there any scheduled things housekeeping things we need to know, Craig? We're going to take a break at some point.
We're going to take a break at about 10:45 for 15 minutes, and then people get coffee and juice and refreshments. Thank you to the Hospitality Commission for the breakfast spread. There'll be a time to ask Meredith questions both after her initial presentation and then after the second time.
Okay.
Tell people who are coming to our house tonight, please come in the side door because there's a mother bird sitting on her nest trying to hatch eggs in the wreath on our front door.
Yes. So if anyone isn't here but plans to come, please share that with them. Leave Mama Bird alone. Yeah, having those babies is tough. All right, let me share with you a little bit about Meredith. Meredith Stone has served as Executive Director of Baptist Women in Ministry since 2020. She's an ordained minister and has previously served as Associate Dean for Academics and Assistant Professor of Scripture and Ministry. My gosh, that's a title. At Logsdon Seminary of Hardin-Simmons University in Congregational Ministry and with other Baptist organizations. Meredith received both her bachelor's and master's degrees from Hardin-Simmons and earned a PhD in biblical interpretation from Bright Divinity at Texas Christian University. Meredith is the author of Empire and Gender in, thank you, my brain was not making the connection, Septuagint Esther, which was written in 2018, along with other academic publications and articles related to women in ministry and religious gender justice. Meredith's advocacy for women among Baptists has been featured in national news outlets such as CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, NPR, and Religious News Service. She lives in Waco, Texas with her husband James and their children. Welcome, Meredith. We're so glad you're here.
Well, it's good to be with you all, and always good to be with my friends Craig and DH. I was grateful for the invitation. So every year in March, the United Nations holds something called the Commission on the Status of Women. People from all over the world come to talk about what is going on with women in different global contexts. And this past March, our organization, Baptist Women in Ministry, sent our director of advocating for women in ministry. She spent a week there. And after attending as many of the sessions as she could, she came back with a couple of conclusions. And one of them was that there is a rising threat to women's equality across the world. Gender equality is not getting better, but globally it is getting worse. This conclusion coincides with a March 2024 article by Kate Walton on CNN, which examined global opposition to gender equality. Despite the hard-fought gains that have been made for the rights of women and girls worldwide, researchers are finding this backlash to progress exists in what's being called anti-gender movements. A quote from the article, and you can't see, I just put a picture of the article. While their exact targets and arguments vary, proponents of anti-gender ideology generally agree that the concept of gender is dangerous because it is changing the way our societies are structured. They view traditional social units, such as male-headed nuclear family head of a household, as the only true moral way to live. The article gives examples of these movements in not only the U.S., but in Turkey, India, Ghana, and more. So in the United States, as we witness the rising influence and presence of Christian nationalism, these anti-gender movements are inseparable from the patriarchal ideology of the conservative evangelical Christian church. In fact, any threat to male power and traditional male roles, as defined by patriarchal readings of Scripture, end up being viewed as a threat to the United States itself. So in a 2021 speech to the National Conservatism, I don't say that word very often, conference, Josh Hawley, a Republican senator from Missouri, an unashamed adherent of Christian nationalism, said, "The left want to define traditional masculinity as toxic. They want to define the traditional masculine virtues, things like courage and independence and assertiveness, as a danger to society. Many men in this country are in crisis, and it's not just a crisis for men," he said, "it's a crisis for the republic." So Christian patriarchy has become this defining feature of the political party that is shaping the nature of our country right now. So these two lectures will address how we prophetically respond to Christian patriarchy in the United States, but in order to do that, I'll first focus on how the power of Christian patriarchy gets exerted, so that in the second lecture, we can talk about how that power gets negotiated, or how we prophetically respond to it. So in my previous life as a professor and in academia, I engaged what are called imperial critical approaches to biblical interpretation. And these types of approaches are how we pay attention to the power dynamics that are reflected within Scripture, how power gets exerted, and then the various ways that power gets negotiated, all within the text or how the texts are contributing to power. And the angle that I would take specifically in these approaches is to consider how the performance of gender is inextricably intertwined with that performance of power and its negotiation. So when I moved into my current role with Baptist Women in Ministry, I brought this framework with me in seeking to understand, how does patriarchy work? How does it control? And then what can we do to negotiate that in our context, especially as women who are limited by that power? So in order to understand this, I utilize a framework that comes from Michael Mann's work on the sources of imperial and social power. In the 4 volumes of his seminal work, The Sources of Social Power, Mann describes societies as constituted of multiple overlapping and intersecting socio-spatial networks of power. It's a lot of words, but he demonstrates that these networks of power come from 4 sources: ideological, economic, military, and political power. It's called the IEMP model that gets used very often. So one way how we can understand what it looks like for power to get exerted by the patriarchal Christian church is through this framework, these 4 sources of power that are employed on behalf of the kingdom of God at which men are at the helm. So as we consider these 4 sources of power, I'll describe first each one of them within a geospatial context in order to understand what it's like, and then make connections to the patriarchal Christian church. And at the end of this lecture, then I'll make connections to how that looks as this power is exerted within society at large in the United States. So first is ideological power. So within an empire, or a geospatial kind of entity, an empire, ideological power looks like influencing the ways that people think and believe, so that there is a grand meta-narrative that supports why the empire should be in power. So this ideology makes people believe that the empire and its representatives are superior, divinely anointed to be in power positions. Kind of like the myths of Romulus and Remus, which underlie Roman superiority in the Roman Empire. And that's one of the pictures up there, Romulus and Remus and the wolf. So imperial ideology creates a story that tells people why those in power are not only superior, but also benevolent. The kind of leaders that people need. They're the leaders who will put the interests of everyone except for themselves first. You think Rome is, so generous because they throw bread at you at the imperial processionals, so maybe you'll forget how you have to pay 60% of your material wealth in taxes. They want you to associate Rome with peace, and they talk about the Pax Romana, so that maybe you'll forget how that peace was achieved at the cost of losing your land and your family getting killed. A perfect example of this comes from the musical Hamilton, when Great Britain's King George is singing about the revolution happening against him in America. Anybody Hamilton fans? A little bit. Okay, he says, "You'll be back, soon you'll see, you'll remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell, you'll remember that I served you well. Oceans rise, empires fall, we have seen each other through it all. And when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. So it's this idea of benevolence and love that is represented by these battalions. It's ideology that makes you think, oh, of course this should happen. They love us. That's why they're doing this. So when conquered or colonized people believe that kind of ideology of empire, then they are much more easy to control. The emperor loves us, doing what's best for us. So it's a believable story that allows people to be controlled and tells them why the control benefits them, that makes them less likely to revolt. So now moving then this idea of ideological power in the patriarchal Christian church, we may consider how it influences the ways people think and believe in order to maintain its control. We could talk about adherence to all kinds of theological viewpoints that might be used in order to become tools that hold the church's power. But a huge part of holding on to that power is patriarchy. Because patriarchy provides the justification for why those in power, men, specifically male church leaders, why they should be in power, or why it's in the rest of our best interests for them to be in power. If something or someone is divinely appointed, then it makes them harder to resist. So we get this grand meta-narrative that identifies why the Christian church is God's plan for all humanity, and why those who are in power, the men, are divinely anointed to be there. Ideology about this narrative and authority leads people to believe and sometimes blindly trust those who are in power. However, consciously or unconsciously, it leads people to believe that those in authority are superior. And so we believe, like the selfless love of the husband in Ephesians 5, whose wife should submit to him, that those in authority and with power must be acting benevolently, always with the interests of others in mind. So when you think about interactions of people with pastors, specifically male pastors in traditionally patriarchal Christian churches, there's almost a blind trust that people put in these pastors. For example, in a case study that I recently heard from the victims of this situation, there was a woman who worked for a denominational group, and she was at a conference for that denomination. Her husband was also an associate pastor at a church in the same denomination. And while she was there, a pastor of one of the flagship churches, one of the big name pastors, started talking to her. She felt honored, and so she continued the conversation. And as the man was having to leave, he invited her to his hotel room later that night, where he said there was going to be a party. She agreed, thinking this would be a good chance to connect with someone who could help her and her husband. But when she arrived, she was the only one there. He complimented her appearance and tried to say more people will be arriving soon, but she was suspicious. He then invited her to dance. She declined, so he offered her some wine. She took a sip and tried to engage in conversation while he moved closer and asked her to dance again. And at that point, she realized no one else was coming to the room, and so she immediately left. In this instance, some might say, the woman should have been suspicious of this request of the pastor. She shouldn't have gone to the room. But here's the thing, the ideological power of the patriarchal Christian church is designed so that we immediately give credence to this pastor instead of having that kind of suspicion. We trust him. So for those of us who might have had that inclination to think that the woman should have been suspicious and not gone to the pastor's room, that's an indication that we would be under the spell of the ideological power, because we would be moving blame from the victim to the harmful and violent actions of the pastor, he's supposed to be divinely anointed and benevolent. And so somehow we make it the fault of the victim. This is the way that ideological power works, by deeply changing even our responses to difficult situations, making us trust those in power and immediately be suspicious of victims instead of vice versa. So moving on to economic power. That was our first one, ideological. Economic power, when thinking about an empire, any kind of empire will need to have control over the systems of extracting, producing, buying, selling, consuming goods as a means of maintaining its control. If people are able to gain economic power individually, then they would have something to wield over the empire itself. So the empire needs to have control over the movement of money and material goods as a means of controlling people. The empire needs to keep all of the economic power in its hands rather than it going into the hands of its opponents. So in addition to controlling the means of production, the empire also exerts taxes and tariffs, things like that, in order to make sure that they control the distribution of wealth in their favor. So in thinking about economic power then in the patriarchal Christian church, who holds the decision-making power with regard to money in the patriarchal Christian church? For over 2,000 years, it has almost always been men. Talk about generational wealth. It can be seen also on the church and denominational, institutional level. The more money an entity has, the more the way it exerts its power includes extracting even more money from people and then controlling the movement of that money. The bigger the institution, the larger the financial bureaucracy. And then any action that might cost the church money, the institution money, any action that might challenge the need for blind trust in male authority, those actions wind up being nixed because losing money means losing power and influence. At an individual level, the patriarchal Christian church wields this economic power over women as women in ministry wind up being paid less by churches. They control women from being ordained when ordained ministers make more money and have more tax benefits, by banning women from elder boards or deacon bodies where decisions are made related to the spending of money, and on it goes. And so when the patriarchal Christian church might make a move to decide maybe we do want to affirm women's equality, maybe we do want to affirm women in ministry, they might have a tendency to go, we can't be seen as too affirming, because then the people in their churches or systems might be tempted to get up and leave if we're too affirming, if we change too much. And so then the protection of the economic power, the money that would leave with those people, becomes the ruling ideology that helps them make decisions. Instead of elevating those who have been oppressed, as Christ's example shows us to do, they choose money over people. That's the way economic power works. The rich get richer, and the oppressed are treated as less than human. It's economic power. Moving then to political power. In empires and in societies, political power includes all the ways in which the interactions and behaviors of people are regulated, from the center of power out to those who exist under it. So this includes laws, customs, regulations, policies, systems of governments which we either submit to or face the consequences, all of which are ways in which an empire would control people's actions and thus limit people's ability to gain any power on their own. So in the same way, the patriarchal Christian church has created rules, some of which overlap with ideological and economic power. That's this multiple overlapping way that these power structures work. But the church has rules about what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do, who can be in leadership and who can't, who can be a member and who can't, what you have to give to the church. This even extends down to who gets to vote on church policies, who can take the Lord's Supper, who can be on a committee, how the committees operate, how Robert's Rules of Order become gatekeeping for decision-making. So while political power comes from these rules and these policies that exist, it also winds up coming from the rules and policies that don't exist. Because those in leadership are the one who have the power that allows them to be the one to make the rules and policies. Thus, in the absence of them, they're the ones who get to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, what actions are held accountable and which are not. So in the example I gave earlier of the story of the woman with the pastor of the flagship church, there were no policies that existed as to holding this pastor accountable. Thus, those who had the political power decided what would happen to him. And since they knew that there would be economic consequences, nothing happened to him. There was no rules to hold him accountable, and thus those in power got to decide what's acceptable and what's not. Now moving on to the fourth area, which is military power. And I tend to think of this more as physical power, because this is the way in which empires exert physical aggression and defense in order to maintain their power. It not only happens in the conquering of new lands, but also in the enforcement of law and order. It's policing. But even more, it's the way the physical presence of the empire's muscle looking over your shoulder makes you stay in line. how the memory of the destruction of that physical power of an empire can cause makes you fear it. When we think about the physical power of the patriarchal Christian church, we might first think about the ways, the church has had crusades before and they conquered lands, how conversion was forced with physical power. But when I think about the military or physical power wielded by the patriarchal Christian church today, I think about the ways in which women have had the physical presence of men looking over their shoulder to make sure they stay in line. How women have memories about the destruction of the physical power of men has caused them or those they love, which makes them have fear. I think about the men who use physical force over their spouses and children to keep them in line. I think about the way women have to be afraid of walking alone in the dark or even in the church parking lot, or being the one who has to leave and turn the lights off in the church building. Physical power creates the systems which allow and enable men to have power over women's bodies, to use them to their own benefit, and they get to exert that power however they choose. And when they exert that power, it serves to keep the power structure of the patriarchal Christian church in place, because women are going to be fearful of reprisal of going against men or reporting men when they exert this power. Further, women may not even want to be alone with men for mentoring and guidance when the types of things described in that case study happen far too often. So if physical power keeps women from receiving the mentoring and the guidance from those in power, who are most often still men, then those women are kept from gaining access to the power structures themselves, and thus the power of the patriarchal church is perpetuated. Not to mention the fact that women are not considered fully human, but only sexual objects that elicit temptation and thus can't be alone with a man, as the Pence-made popular Billy Graham rule stated. That's not to say that we shouldn't have boundaries, but rules that say men can't be alone with women, once again, regulate women's bodies to ensure that male power stays in place. So, with all this in mind, when you think about the patriarchal Christian church as an entity of power, using these overlapping networks of ideological, economic, political, and physical power to maintain its control, one way we might see this playing out is through the huge problems that have existed with sexual abuse and its cover-up in the two largest denominations in the United States, the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention. The picture, by the way, is from the Houston Chronicle whenever they did the expose on 700 pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention who had abused women, children, or men. So not only has this sexual abuse epidemic been reflective of the physical exertion of power in the patriarchal Christian church, it winds up overlapping with all the rest of the networks of power. Because if the ideology that men have over women is questioned, then the economic stability of the church is affected. When you challenge men who commit or cover up sexual abuse, people worry about the power of the whole. Economically, they worry, we're going to lose money if we come out with this, if we do anything to hold these people accountable. Politically, people argue that, these rules about men having authority over women, they've worked for 2,000 years, so why should we change them? Because, when you change one rule or policy, then the rest of the laws and regulations will have to be looked at as well. And then third, ideologically, the ideology of power in these situations when there's cover-up, that ideology has to be unchallengeable, which is why conservative evangelicals equate men's power over women in the church with the entire authority of the Bible itself, not to mention as an aberration to the order of creation. This is why when I've dared to speak out and suggest that actually taking action to affirm women's equality is a good idea, that sometimes I have been called an obstacle to the gospel, or I have been compared to the serpent in Genesis who deceives humanity away from following the created order. The SBC creates punishments for churches who do certain things, and the same punishment is applied to churches that cover up sexual abuse as churches that affirm women as pastors. Can they not see the difference between harm and positive ministry? No, because they can't. The ideology makes them say our power must be protected in this way. And don't get me wrong here, we can't just level these accusations at the Catholic Church and Southern Baptists and conservative evangelicalism, because 2,000 years of how power has worked historically in the Christian church has influenced these same issues in appearing in denominations that have tried to move away from patriarchy. The reality is that power always acts to protect itself, and so these deeply embedded foundations of power don't want to let go, and they emerge when they feel threatened. So now, in the final section of this first lecture, I want to make some connections for you to the broader U.S. society and how the sources of power in the patriarchal Christian church are present in what we see in rising Christian nationalism. So in order to do that, first we need to define what Christian nationalism is. So according to the Baptist Joint Committee's Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, Christian nationalism is, quote, a political ideology that seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy, end quote. Therefore, some people tend to think of Christian nationalism and Christianity as the same thing. However, Christian nationalism uses the veneer of Christianity to advocate for its own aims, to point to a political party or ideology, a way in which they can maintain power. Examples of this can be seen in the persistent presence of the Christian flag alongside the American flag during political rallies. It can be seen in the ways that the current president is equated with Jesus, called the Messiah, and sells Bibles with his name on it. And how political leaders like House Speaker Mike Johnson suggest that the separation of church and state is not a constitutional principle. And how Colorado Representative Lauren Boebert says that Christians need to put God back at the center of America, and claims that the battle with the left, in that battle, that God is on our side, the right side. So the examples are numerous. But it's also important to note that the oppressive structures that have intersections with Christian nationalism also exist, because Christian nationalism is about power, and thus it interacts with other oppressive structures that are trying to exert and maintain power as well. The first is racism. Christian nationalism has often been called white Christian nationalism because of the ways in which it is intertwined with white privilege. This can be seen in the ways that DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, initiatives, and efforts are under attack. The denial that racism exists, or rejecting that racism has been a founding and shaping aspect of the United States, unfortunately. And in addition to that, another oppressive structure that intersects with Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism is patriarchy, or sexism. In her book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupting a Faith and Fractured a Nation, Christian Cobes-Dumais describes how evangelicalism moved toward a militant, masculine version of Christianity in the latter half of the 20th century. So just as the civil rights movement was gaining steam, specifically as desegregation was making progress, white men perceived the power they had was waning. And while never overt, then they started to move the dominant themes of conservative evangelical Christianity to increase their volume and movement toward an extreme form of patriarchy that was tied into Christian nationalism and masculine power together. If the power was threatened in terms of how white privilege was being exerted, then they were going to then try to protect the power when it comes to patriarchy. So that speech that I mentioned from Josh Hawley earlier, it's a prime example. He talked about the crisis of American men being a crisis for the Republic. He says liberty requires virtue, and in particular, manly virtues like courage, independence, and assertiveness. America needs good men, he says. And then he goes on to describe how good men are created, saying, faith and manhood are linked, because for centuries men have looked to faith, to the Bible, to understand who they are and what they can be. So in this time of turmoil, our ancient faith can guide us again. That's how you transform a nation. He's talking about faith and men using faith in order to transform America and merging these ideas of patriarchy and Christian nationalism. In thought process like this that are exerted, we can see the ways in which the four sources of societal power play out. For political power, the rules, regulations, laws, and creation of power structures, There's a movement in the U.S., as we see this playing out in broader society, for women to no longer be able to vote, or to be forced to vote how their husbands would dictate. Additionally, the executive branch of the government has recently been assessing ways to force women to have more babies. And that actually connects then, of course, with economic power, because wielding the economic power to carry out this political power, forcing the women to have babies, they're considering a potential $5,000 so-called baby bonus in tax deductions. Even more than just that tax bonus, then, when women do have more children, they can't hold a job in a country that doesn't have mandated parental leave, where child care often costs more than your mortgage payment. Republicans are pushing to remove even the tax credit for child care, and yet with all this talk of having more children, there are some states that are banning access to IVF options for reproduction. Political power regulates women's bodies, and then the economic power enforces that regulation to keep women under control. Another example of the economic power structures of patriarchal Christian nationalism could be found in the trad wife movement, traditional wife movement, which is becoming popular in conservative Christianity all over TikTok, and which governs these Christian nationalist ideals. So if you're a trad wife, a traditional wife, the movement dictates that you have to ask your husband for permission to spend money. You have to ask what you can wear and what books you're allowed to read. Any ability to gain economic power, ideological power, is removed so that men can maintain their power in the economic sphere. Then in considering physical or military power, we might consider all the ways in which power is exerted to affect women's bodies. In addition to forcing women to have more babies, there are constant threats to women's health as access to appropriate health care, and specifically reproductive health care, is denied. But in addition to the effects of changes in health care, I also think of specifically how the U.S. president, again, who has been compared to the Messiah, and who some say should have been considered for the job of Pope, how he is a known rapist who has received judgment in civil suits to pay millions of dollars because of the rape that he committed. And yet he's the Messiah. See the patriarchy and Christian nationalism coming together? So then in the final source of power, ideological, all that I've just mentioned supports an ideology that says women are less valuable than men. That women need men to take care of them. We need men to save the country, to lead us toward right living. We saw it in the rhetoric that surrounded female candidates for president. We see it in the ways that women are disregarded. We see it in the list of books that are banned by the anti-DEI efforts, targeting not only books that deal honestly with race and sexuality, but also books that deal with women, feminism, and gender. An example of how the ideology of the patriarchal Christian church is affecting U.S. politics was noted by Beth Allison Barr in a recent article that she wrote about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and his wife. Jennifer Rauschett, a former Fox News producer, attends meetings with her Defense Secretary husband. She manages his schedule. She is always with him, and was even included in the infamous signal chats that had military action plans for Yemen. She has no political role. She's not elected, she's not appointed, she is not paid by the U.S. government, and yet she is in all of these meetings. And Barr described how this is the exact model of the pastor's wife in a church, as women are simply expected in these patriarchal Christian churches to be present, to blindly support their husband's ministry or leadership or mission, so much so that their presence is disregarded because it's inconsequential. They are simply an extension of their male husband. Women have no personhood in this situation. This is how the model of the pastor's wives in a church is being transferred over to the roles of leaders in the Christian nationalist government. So in this way, we have to pay attention to the actions and ideology of conservative evangelicalism because, as Barr says, these actions are a harbinger of things to come in our government. So in order to negotiate power and prophetically respond to it, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, we have to understand how this power works. And so this is the framework that I approach it from: ideology, economic, political, and physical power. So that is kind of the conclusion of my remarks for this first lecture. What questions or thoughts do you have that we can take a few minutes for? Yes, ma'am.
Please tell me that trad wife handbook was just.
It's current. You can buy it on Amazon. It's not old. It is new.
It's not a Meredith.
No. This is real. The TikTok videos, they're women who they dress up like 50 with their pearls and everything. And yeah, and it's a movement. All these women are jumping on board with it. Yes.
What does trad mean?
Say that again. Yeah, they mean just submitting to their husbands, and it's more a picture of the 1950s ideal of womanhood than having anything to do with biblical womanhood. What people call biblical womanhood is an ideal created by the patriarchal Christian church. If we were talking about biblical womanhood, we'd have to involve a whole lot more things. That would mean being, one of 5, 10, 12 wives to a husband. That's biblical marriage, right? There's all kinds of polygamy in the Bible. We see in the Old Testament times when women who are raped are forced to marry their rapists. That's biblical womanhood. So we have to be careful. And what they've done is just to equate whatever they've decided is the ideal of womanhood. And they call it biblical womanhood, even though it does not take into account the breadth of Scripture. Yes, ma'am.
I saw a video on TV the other day of a woman whose name I can't remember. She was very well spoken, an author, who was quite concerned about the distressing and depressing, she thinks, impact that AI is beginning already to have on gender equality. And the images of women that AI will be and is creating. Have you investigated any of that yet, or are you?
Yeah, I haven't dug deep into it, but a lot of this idea that I mentioned at the beginning of the anti-gender movements, one of the things that they say is causing that is the way in which social media works in order to play on, hate. They thrive on hate because that gets more clicks. And so much of the way that social media operates in order to decide what it sends you is happening through AI. AI is managing all of these things, and it pays attention to if you just pause in your scrolling, that then it's going to give you more of that. And that's all coming through artificial intelligence.
I think she was specifically concerned about sexuality.
Yeah.
The women that are being generated that take us back to an earlier time where women are sexualized.
Yeah.
Objects.
And we have no regulations right now around AI. So if we have regulations around images of children being used in pornography, if it's not actual children but AI generates it, are there laws against that? Against the pornography that sexualizes women's bodies? If AI creates it, is it regulated in any way? So technology, there are people who are saying AI is going to change our society more than the internet did. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, it's painful. Yes, ma'am.
Places that are looking at the ethics of AI?
Yes, there are. Yeah, I am closely connected into the School of Social Work at Baylor, the Diana Garland School of Social Work, and there are a few of the professors there who have entered into the research field of ethical use of AI. There are conferences that are going on, and so I think we're going to see more and more advocacy groups developed in order to advocate for policies and ethical practices of AI. Yeah. My husband works in a community foundation, and he has just kind of as a side project picked up research on AI and how it's being used in nonprofit space. And it's so interesting the positive ways it can be used to help nonprofits, help people. But for every positive way he sees it being used, he finds these really negative ways. And so he's trying to think about how do we educate nonprofit leaders to use this in ways that can help them without taking advantage of people. Okay. Well, so the second, one more question. Yeah. I think always we have the overlapping oppressions that are affecting. So when we think about the effects on women's health, the effects on women's health for Black and brown women are exponentially. Maternal death rates for Black and brown women are astronomical right now. In a developed country, you would think that women should be able to have babies without dying, but that's not the case. And so I think in every sphere, the overlapping oppressions and the way in which power is being exerted is always going to affect Black and brown women more adversely. And then you'll get the complications that exist within that.
I was specifically thinking about the Black church.
Yeah.
That's just a whole different thing in many ways.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on Black church. I'll say a few things that I have learned. In the Black church, it will kind of come up a little bit in the next one. The Black church was developed as space for people who did not have power to be able to have agency and to be able to express how they felt, to have hope, and to have a sense of power. And so in some ways it needed to be a protected space in order to be able to feel and express what they were thinking. And within that, the church became a place where Black men could have respectable occupations, to society at least. They could make a good wage. And so it's interesting how patriarchy became embedded within a space that was designed to challenge oppression, but it did so because it was trying to demonstrate that Black people can have leadership and power and can be thoughtful and can lead over people, but then it wound up taking in some of the structures that existed from white Christian church and applying them. Again, I am not an expert. These are some things that I have learned and applied, but yeah, it's much more complicated than just saying this is a space that's fighting oppression. There's always multiple oppressions at play and trying to figure out what ways are those being negotiated, even if other oppressions are coming into play. That was a complicated answer. Well, let's take, what do you want, Craig? You want to go till 11? Well, 11:05.
Yeah, let's go to
11:05 it is. And we'll come back and talk about negotiating power now, the flip side, to live from underneath. Well, I know that that was not very hopeful, but hopefully there is hope. Hopefully there is hope in this part of ways to move forward. So as I mentioned at the outset, during my time practicing empiriocritical approaches to biblical interpretation, I developed not only that framework for understanding how power gets exerted, but also a framework for the varied and complex means by which power is negotiated. That negotiation of power will be our topic for this lecture, and I'll begin with an introduction to the idea of negotiation in order to create the framework, and then I'll have suggestions of ways in which we can have a faithful prophetic response to Christian patriarchy. So oftentimes when we think about oppressive power and those who exist under it, we might say something like, we need to fight the power. And what we mean by that is we want to join in groups who are taking visible public action that decries the harmful nature and effects of certain power structures. When we fight the power, we join a Black Lives Matter march, a March for Our Lives. We participate in pride festivals and events. We protest stores that roll back their DEI efforts. We write letters to our legislative representatives and more. And when we live in this fight the power modality, we often see that those who are not publicly and loudly condemning power, we see them as accommodating to power. There's this really powerful sentiment which says we must be loud and visible in order to be faithful in fighting oppression. But drawing upon social scientific and anthropological research into oppressed people groups, empiriocritical approaches to biblical interpretation use frameworks which recognize that these poles of either accommodation or active revolt are not the only two means of adequately negotiating power. When we reduce it to the poles, then we are leaving out so many people and so many methods in between. So this host of means to negotiate in between the two poles are the reason that the word negotiate, why I use that word instead of a word like resist, which would have a very monolithic tone that indicates only active revolt. So in fact, even the phrase fight the power employs multiple means of negotiation. While there's an active revolt element to the phrase, it also employs what we call post-colonial mimicry. In opposing power structures that are harmful, if we use the language of fight, then we are mimicking the violent methodology of the power structures. And I would suspect that we actually want to deconstruct that violent methodology rather than adopt it. However, because we use this language that's familiar to us, and in doing so, we might end up actually reinforcing those ideals of violence into our negotiation. Even though there's reinforcement, though, calling people to fight the power is still negotiation, and it's still a challenge of the power itself. So even in that phrase, fight the power, we find that negotiation is layered. And that means we need to create space for the fact that negotiation can take place in a number of ways besides accommodation and active revolt. And the key to making space for that multivalent negotiation is by understanding the agency of people in subordinate groups. A person in a subordinate group has been dictated their whole lives as to what are permissible forms of behavior from the people who are in power over them. They have no agency over their actions. So if they're then told, this is the only faithful way you can respond to power, then once again, their agency gets removed. So honoring that agency means recognizing that sometimes people in subordinate groups act a certain way in public that is not consistent with their actual attitudes and motivations. In other words, if a person at a protest against police violence is approached by a police officer who requests that that person move to another location, and the protester responds by saying, "Yes, sir," and then moving to the new location, that person is not simply accommodating to the power, but with their agency, they are choosing to perform accommodation to the request in order that they might further their opportunity to continue protesting, to continue negotiating. Honoring agency makes space for that person's public performance of negotiation to not match its final intended purpose. It makes space so that someone can be accommodating to power while fighting it. that someone can recognize that their actions perpetuate or reinscribe some form of the four sources of power, while simultaneously acting in confrontation of the power. Like our fight the power example, public performance may reinforce violent methodology, but that's not the intended purpose. They are just using language that people understand, even though that language is freighted with power itself. Have I made it complicated enough? So here's the bottom line. There are more ways to negotiate or to prophetically respond to power than simply active revolt. And the key to being able to access and honor all those ways we can respond is we always need to honor the agency of the person under power so that they have the right and opportunity to choose how they will negotiate. So for this second lecture, I'm going to be following James C. Scott's Domination and the Arts of Resistance, which is a socio-scientific and anthropological work, which considered how oppressed peoples use different realms of negotiation. So I'm going to move through these four realms, first starting with the safest realm of negotiation and moving toward the most dangerous. I'll describe each realm and then offer some examples first of what negotiating Christian patriarchy in this realm looks like for women in ministry and the organization I lead, Baptist Women in Ministry, because that's my context. And then I'll consider how that form of negotiation might look like in response to the presence of Christian patriarchy in the broader context of the U.S. And honestly, you can look at these and you can be thinking about any form of power in our country, in our society, and imagining examples of how we might respond and negotiate through them. So the first and safest realm of negotiation is flattery and deference. I know, it sounds like accommodation. But people in subordinate groups can use flattery of those who are in the dominant group and public deference in order to secure better conditions for themselves or more humane treatment. As I mentioned, the key to understanding this is separating the public performance from motivation. So for James C. Scott, he recounts how African slaves in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries learned to, quote, play dumb in order to ingratiate themselves to their masters. They knew that if their masters considered them smart, they would begin to worry about insubordination. Thus, acting in deference became a political resource for the slaves. Scott writes, if we see only the deference to the dominant group as accommodation, then we, quote, see the performance as totally determined from above, and we miss the agency of the actor in appropriating the performance for its own ends. He says what may look from above like the extraction of a required performance can easily look from below like the artful manipulation of deference and flattery to achieve its own ends. So as a woman in ministry, I already see Jillian smiling, negotiating Christian patriarchy, I have lived all ends of this spectrum. And I can tell you that there are times when deferring to the male leader in the room or just keeping my mouth shut enables me the opportunity to stay in the room and to maybe have an opportunity to say something later. I'm currently working as an interim co-pastor of a church, and I was in a meeting recently with my male co-interim and 3 male leaders of a denominational group that we are working with. When the meeting started, I was really quick to address the man who called the meeting as Dr. So-and-so. He and everyone else followed suit, addressing each other as Dr. this and Reverend that as appropriate, even making jokes when they hadn't quite finished their doctorates. But no one in that Zoom room referred to me as Reverend Dr. Stone. They only referred to me as Meredith. Now, I could have requested at any point that they call me Reverend Dr. Stone, as I was doing for them, and they were going to all this trouble, but I just continued to refer to Dr. So-and-so and Reverend that other guy and kept my mouth shut when they said Meredith. And that was my choice, an act of agency on my part to choose to defer to them with their titles and not to require them to extend the same courtesy to me. It was a choice I made because being respected was not my end goal or my motivation for the meeting, but my deference created space to move toward that end goal. So another way this looks is in our organization with our staff and how we even word things like articles and calls to action. Because it would be really easy to say to men who are our allies and advocates, you just think you've been affirming of women in ministry, but you need to do better, so here's what you need to do next. But instead of saying that, I think it's actually even more kind and respectful to say, while we know you have been faithful to advocating for women in your congregation and community for decades through bold and courageous acts of affirmation, we're asking you to take the next courageous step and acting on your commitment. You see the difference? We're saying the same thing, but we're choosing to negotiate. And we can do that out of even respect for those who are trying, out of respect for the agency of the person that we're calling to take more action. So for how for our Christian community or Christian individuals might utilize this realm of negotiation to prophetically respond to Christian patriarchy in the U.S., flattery and deference might play out in our personal interactions with those who are perpetuating Christian patriarchy. As we have conversations with those people, we might find things that we share in common with them, even compliment that person on how they are living out a shared value. We might say something like, I see that you care deeply about your community and you're living that out through your church's food pantry ministry. That's commendable, and I bet it's making a difference. We might not agree with them on anything else or any other way that their church ministry happens, but finding that one thing that we can compliment could create space for you to be heard when you ask them to consider women's equality in a different way. You can address your local, state, and federal representatives with this same respect and deference for their position and anything good that they've accomplished recently. In Texas, just this past week, a bill passed both the House and the Senate, now it's on the governor's desk, which banned non-disclosure agreements in sexual abuse cases. When? This is huge. So the next time that I reach out to my state representative, Pat Curry, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for making that happen. And do you see how the recent women's rights bill disadvantages intersex persons? Both and. And so even more than just flattery of individuals or deference in that situation, it's also a matter of choice on how we choose to relate to people in power groups generally. For example, people who want to negotiate Christian patriarchy can choose to stay a part of Christian entities that do have patriarchal values. They can choose to stay. In the same way that not every member of this church agrees 100% on every matter of doctrine, there are people in the Southern Baptist Convention and Roman Catholic Church who do not agree on the tenets of patriarchy. As long as they have been able to have and exercise their own agency to choose to stay, and not that they were forced to stay, because that's different, I think it's important that we make space for that choice. If people fighting patriarchy in the Southern Baptist Convention had left in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and no one would have stayed in proximity, this church might not exist. I know that there are so many of us women who came out of those situations who would have simply been left behind. We can't write people off simply because they've chosen to stay in certain systems, because their public engagement might not match what's going on the inside. It's always more complicated than we think. Jillian pulled out during the break a copy of The Pastor's Wife that Weldon had given to his wife and demonstrated how change can even take place over the course of someone's life, as where he would never have given her this book on how to, act appropriately as a pastor's wife at the end of his life. But at the beginning, but it just goes to show, if he had been left behind, if we had not stayed and chosen to continue the message, where would he have been? We can't leave people behind. That's not to say that it's not okay to leave too, because it is okay to leave. And I think what happens is we all end up choosing boundaries that we refuse to cross, or that we refuse for the system to cross against us. And when we set those boundaries and they do get crossed, that's when we know it is time to leave. But all of us might set those boundaries in different ways. So our prophetic and faithful response can look like staying sometimes in patriarchal spaces. In our communities and in our church, this realm of flattery and deference is mainly an opportunity to create space for further negotiation. And for women, when we choose this form of negotiation, it's a way that we can protect ourselves against the backlash that we inevitably receive when we do choose to challenge patriarchy directly. So that's the first realm. The second realm of negotiation is hidden transcripts. So as we acknowledge the separation of our public performance and our motivations, then our public performances always take place in the view of those who are in power. So our performance is always for them. But the converse then is that what is actually true of our attitudes and motivations of the subordinates, those existing under power, they need a chance to be revealed. And they get revealed in the hidden transcript so that they're hidden from view of those in power. So there are moments when people in subordinate groups can safely speak the words of anger and hurt and self-assertion that they feel but have to conceal. And those moments create space for the hidden transcripts. In the example that Scott uses of slaves in United States society who chose to perform deference to their masters to protect themselves, they would then need a safe space to release everything that they couldn't say all day long. And doing that, creating that space, like the churches, was an act of negotiation because it gave them the internal resources so that they could continue negotiating during the day. So my translation of what Scott calls hidden transcripts is creating a space for like-minded and like-hurt community. A community where we can be fully seen and known and express our frustrations. We need spaces to come together and name the oppressive nature of the patriarchal church. And the simple act of coming together and naming it among like-minded people is an act of negotiation. It is a faithful response to Christian patriarchy. So for women in ministry, specifically among Baptists of the group that I lead, we were organized in 1983 for women who felt called to ministry in the Southern Baptist Convention. And our original purpose statement was to provide support for the woman whose call from God defines her vocation as that of minister or that of woman in ministry within the Southern Baptist Convention. So the women who first came together to organize for this organization, their first meeting happened in the basement, a hidden location, of Reba Cobb's home. And they sat around and they shared their stories. They talked about how they had felt this call from God. They heard women share stories that they had never heard other women say before. And in doing so, they were able to experience this sisterhood. And in this way, BWIM became a place for the hidden transcript. What women couldn't say in their churches without fear of reprisal, they could say when they gathered together as Baptist women in ministry. But eventually, men came along and joined the meetings in those early years, as was needed. But it didn't take long before the women of BWIM were branded as strident, or those angry women. And there were even some women who didn't want to participate in this negative kinds of speech against power. They wanted the balance of positive to the release of negative feelings and anger. And in doing so, whenever those folks were apart, then the safety of the hidden transcript was compromised. And it just goes to show, one, that different types of negotiation are right for different people. And we need to honor that different spaces are needed. And two, that there was a need for a safe space where the hidden transcript could find voice. So today, as a Christian community and Christian individuals, a way that you can have a faithful prophetic response to Christian patriarchy is to ensure that those spaces exist, that space is created for those who have been hurt by Christian patriarchy to express that hurt, for their pain to be seen and not judged. We constantly get asked at BWIM, how do I get involved? Or what can I do to be a part of this? That women ask us. And I'm convinced that it's because they need a safe space for the hidden transcript. So if an individual comes to this church having been hurt by patriarchy, instead of telling them, well, that doesn't exist here, so let's just move on, which I don't think y'all would say, we need to find ways to honor their pain and make space for them to share it. Part of honoring that pain is education. Educating people about the dangers of Christian patriarchy, like we've been talking about. the forms that Christian patriarchy takes, naming the power structures like we discussed, ideologically, economically, politically, and physical violence. Through education, we create a space where the realities can be named and maybe even the harms can be lamented. So a very specific example of that and how we can educate our churches is to help each other spot the signs of domestic violence and then to offer support to people in those situations. 1 in 3 women in the United States will experience domestic violence in her lifetime. And that does not exclude progressive churches. So, as we create support groups for survivors of domestic violence, as we educate each other about spotting it and supporting these women and children and men, then we can create space that lament that pain and honor the ways in which domestic violence has been an expression of Christian patriarchy for many years. Education, support groups, lament. These are the types of hidden transcripts that the patriarchal church does not want us to perform, but which need safe spaces in order to happen in restorative ways. And when our churches become safe spaces for those hidden transcripts, then people can have the internal resources they need to keep going. Okay, so that's the second realm. The third realm, then, is political disguise. This is the ways in which what is freely named in the hidden transcript is disguised in some form so that it can find voice in the public transcript. Sometimes, and part of this is because if we voice it in public, then there is reprisal. We face the consequences. So we need to find ways to say all of those things, but disguise it so that there is an outlet for what we need to do. Sometimes this looks like individual forms of disguise, such as using veiled means of public opposition through anonymity. We can write an anonymous letter to the editor, or choosing a person with a non-threatening identity to deliver a message of opposition. For example, when you see a protest and there's a child holding a sign that says, "Protect my future," it's received very differently than an adult who might have a sign which says something that looks like they might actually be able to act on it. The non-threatening messenger enables us to have the message heard and lowers the threat of reprisal. So some ways in which this realm of political disguise can negotiate Christian patriarchy: we can disguise the messenger by using non-threatening entities to deliver our messages. I know as a woman in Christian ministry, with patriarchy embedded in the foundations, there are times that a message I want to say will be better heard by a man than by me. Isn't that interesting? Actually, in all of the social scientific research and work, they talk about using women to deliver messages because they're viewed as non-threatening and apolitical. But yet when we're talking about Christian patriarchy, sometimes the non-threatening presence is a man because they're not viewed as trying to threaten power since they already have it. So instead, they use their power as influence for empowerment. The article that I mentioned from Beth Barr and the book I mentioned from Kristen Kobes-Dumay, which apparently a lot of y'all are familiar with, these are powerful works. But the audience who most needs to read it will probably never do so, since they were written by women and thus are viewed as threatening to power. So political disguise can be about the messenger, but it can also be about the message itself. In subordinate groups, they use things like euphemisms or associations only known to people in the subordinate group. The example that Scott uses is how in Civil War slave hymns, they would sing about Jesus and home as veiled references to the Yankees and the North. Jesus is going to deliver us so that we can go home. The Yankees are going to deliver us so that we can go to the North. And everybody in the subordinate group knew what it was about, but the people in power, as they heard it, it was disguised. They didn't know that was what they were singing about. So we can do the same thing. We can disguise the message in various ways. And one way we can do that is actually through scriptures and stories we use in our sermons and teachings. There's so many stories of God taking care of the oppressed and bringing down the powerful in Scripture. Stories about peace, stories about the powerful and those who are less powerful coming together, the lion lying down with the lamb. We can preach about Babylon and Rome without ever mentioning current expressions of patriarchal power in the U.S. But Babylon and Rome, we all know, right? Underneath power, what we're talking about. The associations are obvious to those who see the power around us for what it is. I also place in this category the post-colonial mimicry that I mentioned earlier at the beginning, because this is a way in which we disguise the message and the messenger as well. Some examples of post-colonial mimicry for women in ministry include the ways in which female preachers sometimes lower our voices, even being told that we need to get voice lessons to learn how to lower our voices so that they will be heard better by our congregations. I actually paid attention one time, and I was listening to a bunch of sermons, and women who had early opportunity in Baptist churches all had lower voices, just naturally. It's interesting, right? So we're told that not only do we need to lower our voices, but we need to lead like men. And so sometimes we slip into the clothing of stereotypical male patterns of leadership so that our leadership can be received, though, of course, we end up getting judged for that, which is inevitable. I even see women's ministry as a form of disguised negotiation of the patriarchal church, even if it doesn't mean to be. Because if they are preaching to women, when women's ministries leaders preach, they demonstrate that women have the ability to preach, to stand in front of an audience and proclaim the word of God. Now, I think it's really important to say that women shouldn't have to lower our voices or lead in traditionally masculine ways or be relegated to women's ministry. But when we give agency to the person who is underpowered to choose, these can be tools that are utilized in order for us to make progress. Beyond then just disguising the message and the messenger, still other more elaborate forms of disguise take place through the arts. Movies, novels, TV shows can subversively call out power under the guise of fiction. Visual art in paintings, in scripture, graffiti, sculpture, graffiti, even TikTok videos and Instagram reels can find ways to express negotiation of power in culturally acceptable forms, even in those that the people in power wouldn't understand. This morning I saw in Craig and DH's kitchen, there was a plate that had a picture of an alligator and a crab stirring the pot of gumbo, I'm imagining. They're being the cooks. They're in the chef's garb. They're normally in the pot, but now they have the power to stir the pot. It's an imagination of a reversal of power dynamics, and that is negotiation of power. An artistic rendering of what it could look like when power gets challenged. Y'all didn't know, did y'all? So the arts are a powerful tool that can permeate our subconscious in ways that not much else can. So now this fourth realm of active revolt. In the geopolitical realm, a group of people banding together to literally fight those in power, take over power for themselves. This is what we imagine revolt to look like. It looks like people standing up and speaking to those in power the words that would normally only be said in the hidden transcripts. A complete breach in the public transcript so that the hidden transcript just becomes completely seen. This might be all the ways in which we challenge the sources of power. In challenging ideology, when we stand and say that women's rights are human rights, that women are fully human and should have no limitations, when we conduct and experience unconscious bias trainings, when we publicly educate people in gender ideology and feminism, the very educational ideals that are being banned by the anti-DEI efforts and that are being branded un-American by patriarchal Christian nationalism. It is a mouthful. That's a picture of me and the Women's March back in 2017, the first inauguration, with some of my students and my children. In challenging economic power, we advocate for equal pay, paid parental leave for all, not just women and men. We advocate for subsidized childcare, removing taxes from female hygiene products. Do y'all still have that here in Louisiana? You do still have it? Y'all got rid of it. Okay, that's good. Not all states have the pink tax. We have to continue advocating for that. When we use the dollars that we have to boycott unjust organizations and donate to organizations that are doing the work of supporting the oppressed and advocating for justice, that's a way that we can do this. When we choose female vendors and providers of services, or vendors and service providers from marginalized communities, that's a way that we can have active revolt and fighting the economic power. Again, in Craig and DH's kitchen this morning, I had some granola with my yogurt, and on the granola there was a little mark that said it was women-owned. You're choosing female vendors. Good job. In challenging political power, then, when we refuse to abide by unjust regulations and advocate for policies and regulations that take the experiences of women into account, that listen to women for input into those policies, when we canvass our friends and family and neighborhoods so that everyone might vote and not just men. Physical power and challenging physical power, when we amplify the voices of the abused, call out abuse and harassment, when we see it in any form around us. Whenever we advocate for better laws against clergy sexual misconduct, and that regular sexual assault and harassment training is required in all workplaces and churches. I just gave you a whole bunch of examples of active revolt and thinking about those 4 sources of power. But the thing about this 4th realm is that when we do all those kinds of things, it's the most dangerous form of negotiation because it often includes the most swift and substantial repercussions. Protesters get put in jail. Preachers who call on the president to do justice and act mercifully are censured. Women who stand up and say, "Me too," get blamed, slut-shamed, and blacklisted. Showing yourself to be a liberal gets you kicked out of associations, job opportunities removed, shunned by friends and family, and your voice taken away from the very systems that shaped you into who you are. And it's because of these consequences that outright public revolt is normally rare. I think we're living in an exceptional time, by the way, that there's such polarization that we see more of this active public revolt than we normally do. But because of the consequences, oftentimes people who are oppressed will choose not to speak out against their oppressors. They know what will happen if they do, and if they don't have a safe place for a hidden transcript, then all of that hurt and anger simmers until it just has to come out somewhere, and it ends up coming out sideways. We call that the post-colonial concept of horizontal violence, because people in oppressed groups have a tendency to take out all of their frustrations on each other. We see it in all kinds of oppressed groups that instead of fighting the power above them, they end up fighting each other for the limited measure of power that they see is available to their group. And they imagine that if one person were to get that limited measure of power, then it's not available to them. So we actively work to stop it. And if we could only see that the idea of limited power is a lie. Our God is omnipotent. This is a gaslighting of our oppressors. If we could only claim the reality that in our God power is limitless, then maybe we would band together and actually be able to push toward more change. And maybe if the punishment might be shared, then it makes the possibility of it more bearable. This horizontal violence works against us. It's a consequence of active revolt that ends up working to keep us down and power perpetuated. So this is another reason why I think coming together and the work of prophetically responding to Christian patriarchy is so important. When we acquiesce to horizontal violence and fight each other, even fighting each other among progressive groups for a number of reasons, then we perpetuate the power of the powerful by diluting our negotiation. We must stand together. We must recognize each other's agency in negotiation rather than fighting each other and dictating the only appropriate ways to challenge patriarchy and other forms of power. This is one of the reasons why our organizational values, we collaboratively set some values that dictate how we do our work. And our first value as an organization is celebration. As an organization that advocates for women negotiating ways in which the patriarchal Christian church limits us, we want to take actions that counter any inclinations that women might have to diminish one another. to diminish our accomplishments and how we choose to navigate the church. So we celebrate any time a woman gets ordained, because that's still a big deal in a lot of places. We celebrate when women are called to senior pastor roles, because that's still a huge deal in most places. We try to integrate celebrating affirmation, success, and progress into everything that we do, so that we're creating a culture that brings women together rather than cultivating discord. But we don't say all of that outright, because baby celebration is actually part of our political disguise in countering the ways in which patriarchy creates horizontal violence. And because maybe celebration of our advocates and allies is part of our flattery and deference, to ensure that those who need to take the next steps in advocacy feel appreciated for what they have done already. See how it all kind of works together? So these are my closing comments, and then we can have time for a few questions. A biblical story that has held deep significance for me over the past 15 years is from Numbers 27. This story comes at a point in the book of Numbers and the wilderness wandering where they're about to enter over into Israel to the promised land. And so they need to do this census in order so that they know all the people who were supposed to die out have done so, and so that they can count the men they have for the military as they're going into battle to get this land. But as they do so, they realize that one man had no sons, and thus was not going to receive any inheritance of land, which was a huge part of counting, knowing who were going to get the inheritances. And so this one man's name was Zelophehad from the tribe of Manasseh, and he had no sons, only these 5 daughters: Machlah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah, and Noah. So the women in this situation, they decide that they're going to approach Moses, Eleazar, all the leaders. They're going to go to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They're going to go see their highest leaders. They're going to stand in the middle of this among millions of people, and they're going to say to them, "Our father died in the wilderness, leaving no sons. Why should his name disappear from his clan simply because he had no sons? Give us property among our father's relatives." You see, women couldn't have property. That wasn't the way it worked. And so they stood there, all 5 of them, and said to Moses, they didn't say please, they just said, "Give us property among our father's relatives." Moses goes and takes their case before the Lord, and the Lord says to Moses, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them land among their father's relatives, and make a law that if this happens ever again, that then those daughters get the land too." So many things I love about this story. One, I love when God says that the women are right. I mean, just Moses, you missed it. The women are right. I love that moment. But 2, I love that the women approach Moses together. Machlah is probably the oldest. Her name is mentioned first. Then she doesn't just say, "Well, the land should be mine," and then they fight each other and figure out who's going to do this, but they all go together. No horizontal violence, only sisterhood. And then 3, when they do that, they not only get the land for themselves, but by banding together, they're able to affect change for the situation of even more women who would come after them. When we come together to fight oppression, women coming together, but also women and men coming together to speak truth to power, to support one another. When we choose political disguise or when we choose deference, we support one another. When we choose active revolt, we support one another. When we make space to hear each other and support one another privately in the hidden transcripts, when we do that, we can always see more change and more lives made better. So may we follow the example of Machlah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah, and Noah, and know that the task of prophetically responding to Christian patriarchy in the U.S. is not something that we do alone. But when we approach it together, we're able to move closer to our vision of a world where everyone is not only created in the image of God, but also respected as a divine image bearer. The end. What questions or comments do you have?
Probably familiar with the recent book James, which
Yeah.
I think won the Pulitzer Prize, and that author takes Jim of the Mark Twain and has him doing what you were just saying, you know, in the context of being a slave, you know, he speaks the language that is necessary, but he's a very erudite,
Yeah.
brilliant guy,
Yeah.
well educated, and so,
Yeah. Yeah.
in private. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, so it's that's a wonderful book for anyone who hasn't read it. It's real short, but yeah, you ought to read James.
Yeah.
So James instead of Jim.
Yeah. And I mean, and these are ways that we can interact. We don't often, we think of it as reserved for only some groups that exist under power, but these are resources that we have of ways we can choose to fight against power that can be for any of us.
Having said what you said about that, makes me feel better about some of the ways that I have conducted myself a lot. Because a lot of times I felt like that if I was holding back in situations such as you talked about, that I
Yeah.
would be less of a person
Yeah.
by doing that. But now I know I was negotiating.
You were. Yes. So in the early days of our organization, there was a lot of tension, a lot of conflict among the women about how they would go about doing things. And I started talking to a few of them who had not talked to each other in 40 years. There's two women who had been at the forefront of our movement. And I told them, I really think what was happening between y'all weren't fighting with each other, but y'all had all of this, pent-up frustration with power, and you didn't know how to express it, and so it wound up coming out sideways. And that matches with the way we think of things, is horizontal violence. So I don't think you were ever actually mad at this person. And the woman said she felt such a relief of I never realized how the power was impacting what we were doing, because we tell each other, you have to do this and you have to do this, and we don't make space to celebrate all of the ways that we can respond that are faithful. So I'm glad that you found some affirmation that you have agency to choose how you respond to power. Getting agency is a huge deal. Yes, ma'am.
I just was gonna say, I've never been one to go to a demonstration or march for any particular cause or whatever, but I did go to Washington DC with my sisters, not for the Women's March,
Yeah.
but for the one before that was for responsible gun laws.
Yes, March for Our Lives, yeah.
But there's going to be a march or a demonstration in Monroe on June 14th, for the No King's Day.
Yeah, yes.
And there's 7 in the state of Louisiana.
Yeah.
And there's gonna be one here. I was
Yeah.
willing to drive to Lafayette, go with my sister, but, I'm about to go to my second protest.
Yeah. Yeah, so,
Where is it gonna be?
Carol Jr. and go right there.
so let's think about this real quick, this example, right? We can go to the protest, that's active revolt against the No Kings. We've just talked about it in a safe space that we reject it. That's a hidden transcript. We just negotiated it by naming it among us as well, if you don't go to the protest. We could choose in some way to listen to our friends who are against, the idea of the protest and try to hear them out, try to understand what they're talking about, and that might be our act of deference to them as well. Politically disguised, we might have to go with a hat on if we don't want to be recognized by our employer that we participate in the revolt, which I've definitely had to do some things in disguise before. But yeah, if we limit and say, you either have to go to this protest or you're not being faithful, then we're so limiting the options that are available to us. And we can also celebrate when we go to our second protest. That's a great way to respond too. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Go back to the first lecture. You made a statement that 1 in 3 women experience physical.
Domestic violence.
Where did you get that information from?
Social work PhD friend who does all of her research on domestic violence. She wrote a book called Taking It Seriously, which is a book written for church leaders to help church leaders know how to respond to domestic violence, to be able to spot the red flags, to know how to educate folks about domestic violence.
What is her name?
Janice Gertzen, spelled with 2 G's. Janice, and then Gertzen, Goertzen. Yeah.
Because violence just kind of take physical violence.
And all forms of violence. So this could be emotional, verbal violence as well. Yeah. I did a lecture a couple of weeks ago for a group of professors and talked about some similar kinds of ideas, but a little bit different. And one of the things I was trying to encourage them was how they can equip their students to live in a world that is defined by Christian patriarchy. And I told them about how with my New Testament survey class, there was a scripture that comes up in 1 Thessalonians that when it would come up in class, I would always use that as an opportunity to talk about consent. I taught on a Christian campus where sexual conduct outside of marriage between a man and a woman was forbidden. But I told them I am not stupid enough to think that sex is not happening on our campus. And so you may not hear about consent anywhere else, but let's talk about consent. And I would go through the whole thing. We would watch a video, football players and grandmothers, and it was always very uncomfortable, but we did it anyways. And I had someone come up to me afterwards, and she said, I attended a Christian campus, and I remember in my experience that there were women who thought that once you became married, you could not say no to sex. There was no possibility that rape could ever exist in marriage. And she said, had we had this conversation about consent, there were probably hundreds, if not thousands, of women who could have known that they had agency over their bodies in a way that they didn't know at that Christian campus. So even that, and thinking about domestic violence and the ways in which Christian patriarchy perpetuates certain ideals, there are women who think that they can't say no to sex and marriage, who are experiencing the harm of domestic violence. I know that got kind of heavy. Sorry. Yeah. Question or time? Okay.
And y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, I'm the only female senior pastor in the Monroe West Monroe area. Does anybody know of any others? And I'm incredibly proud of that. It's not something I spend a ton of time thinking about, and I'm not saying this because I'm so wonderful. So one of the things I think that makes Northminster, one of the many things that makes Northminster different is my great presence in this space. But I do wonder sometimes if that's enough. Do we need to be more vocal
Yeah.
in our advocacy? Because I think for many of us, it's a settled issue. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that I'm female doing this work.
Yeah.
But do we owe it to others to be more vocal? Because I get mistaken all the time for not the pastor.
Yeah.
We had a funeral recently, and DH got mistaken for the pastor, which is absolutely fine. I don't mind. He certainly looks the role. But I have to say to the funeral home
I was in
gentleman.
disguise.
Yeah. And his name was literally Sunny, which just made it all more wonderful. I'm actually the pastor. And he said, "Oh, would you like to be called Pastorette?" No. No, pastor's fine. Yeah, it was funny. I wonder, should we do more? Are we maybe a little too hidden? I mean, we're already the weird church anyway, I think, for a lot of people. So I wrestle with that. Should
Yeah.
we be actively doing more?
I think you have the agency to choose. And part of that comes with boundaries, deciding what your boundaries are. For some people, some women They fought that fight for the first 40, 50, 60 years of their lives, and they're pastoring in a church now, and they're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to do what God called us to do. And they set a boundary because their mental health, emotional health had been affected. For other folks, where their boundaries are might determine their agency to choose to engage it in other ways. And I think part of that is recognizing, as you say, that it's embedded within the community, this education that we're doing. It's so embedded all around you, so that even if you are insulated as a hidden transcript, congregation, think about, where do we see in our community that the foundations of patriarchy are so deeply embedded that we don't even think about them? Just those unconscious things that are existing in everyday life. And could we maybe find a way, not just one way, but a way that matches who we are to respond?
Maybe don't call people pastorette.
I mean, that's a good one. That's a good one.
It feels like there's this fine line between just almost treating the patriarchal system like a child. Like they'll, in the deference, like, let me give you something you're doing really good, and then I'm gonna tell you something you can work on.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, it just feels so icky and submissive.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't really know where that line is, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we all have to decide where it is for ourselves. I've done this talk among a group of women, not this talk, but a version of it, where I talked about the celebration part and our need to celebrate one another. And I had a woman get up and walk out because she said, I just feel so deeply that I have this boundary. I cannot celebrate that woman. And I said, oh, okay, that's perfectly acceptable. You have created your boundary. I hope that you'll choose to celebrate women in other ways. But I think that it is so freighted. And so even if we can acknowledge people can have the agency to use flattery and deference as a mean of negotiation, that doesn't mean it has to be our mode of negotiation. And I can decide my boundary is I don't want to perpetuate the patriarchy in that way. I want to act against it. And so I want to give space if someone else choose that. I want to tell them why I have not chosen it, and then respect their agency in doing it. Does that make sense? At least that's the way I operate. Yeah. 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 That too.
Meredith, I was telling you about Reverend Lee Joyner, who was a lot
Yes.
of the Methodist minister here. Many of us knew her. And Lee, I don't think she ever made a point of being a woman, but she lived out her calling as a pastor.
Yeah.
As D.H. said, every time he went to the hospital, she was there.
Yeah.
And as I remember, she wore a Roman collar, so she
had a car.
She was negotiating so that people would recognize her as a pastor. Yeah.
and of course, she was tragically killed, as I told you, and they changed the name of the church
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
Lee Joyner Memorial, then United Methodist Church, to honor her memory.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's simply living within your context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it was for Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bridge.
Yeah, we named
Yeah.
the bridge, to the bridge, we
Yeah.
named it overpass.
Yeah. That.
I remember that I grew up in that
Oh,
church,
that's right.
Mm.
and it was fascinating to watch her lead that church with the male leadership.
Yeah.
The whole church, the lay leadership of the church, basically was male,
Yeah.
and she knew how to manage them.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Maybe I think it's their idea, or whatever.
Yeah, at this same conference I was at with professors, I was sitting in on a panel, and there were some women who were talking about preparing women for ministry, And one woman who was older said, well, I just always tell my students, if you walk into a room and it's all a bunch of men and they say something like, oh, this room just got a lot prettier, or woo, this room got a lot better looking, don't take that seriously. Just ignore that and do what you came there to do. And I raised my hand and said, how about we also name that is discrimination? That is harassment against her, that she's reduced to her body instead of her leadership when she walks in the room. But she can choose if she wants to ignore it. So when you're teaching your students, you tell them they have a choice. They can stand there and name it as harassment and say, I please do not say that to me again. That is, diminishes my leadership. I would appreciate it if we could act differently. But if she chooses to continue moving, then she can make that choice. But we all need to name together that it is harassment and that those kind of microaggressions build up over time and affect the way that we're able to lead when we're constantly reduced to simply being a body instead of a leader. So that's the both and of we can celebrate that Lee never had to make it about being a woman, and we can name the times when she was diminished because she was a woman, that she had to wear the collar to be recognized as a pastor. And it's hard. It's hard. Yeah. I chose a few years ago when the Southern Baptist Convention started being loud again about women, as they always are, that we were going to engage because the millions of women there who might never hear that they have equal value to God deserve to know that there is a voice somewhere still saying it to them. And because we did that, some people were like, why are you even doing that? Why? Southern Baptists, they're never going to change. It's like, okay, but there are people there, and we care about the people. But there was one woman who posted, and she didn't say it overtly, but she meant it, because I know who she is. She said, I'm over here too busy pastoring my Baptist church to care about what the Southern Baptist Convention is doing. And I thought, that is fantastic that you are able to do that. But there are millions of women who do not have that opportunity. And so please do not disparage us who choose to continue to engage, who choose to continue to speak out in those places. So, even in this place, sometimes the biggest pushback I get is from the progressive side, as where you would think, yeah, it hurts when they say things, they compare me to the serpent and whatever else. But when the progressive side says you're not doing enough, or you shouldn't do it that way, or you should do it this way, that hurts when I've given my whole life to figuring out how to fight for women just like you. So yeah, it's complicated and messy, but sometimes it works. Sometimes churches change. Sometimes women have opportunity and become respected, and sometimes women even get to experience what equality feels like. And that makes it all worth it. And so we keep going, because I hadn't crossed my boundary yet. But one day they might, and I might be done. But until they do, we're going to keep going, keep fighting. Thank y'all for letting me share on a Saturday morning.